special program. And we're very, very honored to have Mike Figelman with us on this evening. And the topic is, to call it Al Quran would be an understatement, because Mike, I suspect that what you specialize and devote your professional life to is a never-ending series of outrages and surprises that really shouldn't be so surprising to us. So we have this wonderful evening here with Honest Reporting Canada. Honest Reporting Canada is an independent grassroots organization that promotes fairness and accuracy in Canadian media coverage of Israel and the broader Middle East. With the assistance of over 50,000 members from coast to coast, Honest Reporting Canada monitors the media, recognizes excellence when it sees it, and exposes inaccuracy and bias in Canadian reporting in the region in the Middle East. Now, Mike Figelman is the executive director of Honest Reporting Canada and is responsible for the day-to-day running of the organization, its financial management and project development. He's a 17-year veteran of the Canadian journalism industry. He's a former editor-in-chief, reporter, anchor of various news programs and publications. His focus is on delivering efficiency and professionalism as Honest Reporting Canada moves into new technological and geographical spheres. Mike is also a human rights expert and a frequent on-air commentator. His work has been published in the Globe and Mail, National Post, Toronto Star, CBC News, and more. And most importantly, he made a point to telling me that he is born and raised in Thornhill, not Toronto. Toronto is that big these days. We have regions. So, Mike, I want to thank you so much for joining us this evening. We have a really large group of people who are here listening, which probably is an indicator of the broad concern that Jews continually have about the what perceives to be an inherent bias as to how the Middle East, the conflicts there, and the state of Israel is frequently portrayed. I can tell you myself personally, whenever there's a cycle of violence involving Israel and the Middle East, my inbox fills up with outrage of people wondering what they can do. I know that speaking from the pulpit frequently is something that I feel I'm called to do, to provide perspective on what is happening. And I'm just wondering, from your broad 17-year perspective, what do you see as, I guess, some of the most common offenders and the narratives that they engage in to twist and misrepresent what takes place in Israel and the broader region?
Well, first, Rabbi, let me thank you tremendously for this opportunity to tell your congregants about Honest Reporting Canada. I want to thank Alan Cheskis for helping organize this event, and for everyone at the shul. In answer to your question, there's so many twins, there's so many habitual offenders, whether in Canada, whether it's the CBC, the English or the French arm, whether it's the Globe and Mail or the Toronto Star. The challenge is Israel is constantly under the microscope and then under the magnifying glass. It is held to an impossible standard, in sharp contrast to the rest of the broader Middle East, which is held to a much lesser standard. When there is a total lack of perspective about how there's a genocide going on against the Rohingya in Myanmar. We're not talking about the Uyghur in China. We're not talking about the Yazidis in Syria and in Iraq. We're constantly talking about what Israel did and didn't do. So when Israel is held to that impossible standard, what Natan Sharansky talked as the 3Ds, the demonization, the double standards, the delegitimization, it's not a surprise that the coverage that is curated and broadcast by our news providers then transcends into habitual acts of anti-Semitism that we see on a daily basis. 2 days ago, Statistics Canada put out a report which acknowledged that 62% of all hate crimes in Canada targeted the Jewish people, Canadian Jewry. And yet we account for, I think, a little over 1% of Canada's total population. And yet that's the disproportionate impact of hate crimes, which are largely fanned by unfair media coverage that lacks context and that paints Israel in a very negative light. Some of the things that we see very often are problematic lexicon. And not to pick apart on a term that you used, but one that you mentioned was cycle of violence. So that's a term that the media use quite often, right? It implies that there really is no no start and beginning, it's a continuation. But the reality is, and you look at the name of Israel's armed forces, they're the Israel Defense Forces. Israel is never really ever on an offensive posture. It's taking preventative measures to defend itself and its citizens against terrorism. And yet Palestinian terrorism is treated as almost an acceptable method of statecraft. That is the portrayal of Israel, and that is the lexicon that is deployed. Other terms that we see that are quite misleading. You'll see in the past couple of weeks, the media picked up on Amnesty International's report claiming that Israel is an apartheid state, ignoring the fact that Israel is a leader in protecting minority rights, where you have Arabs who are at the pinnacle of Israeli society, who are leaders and titans in business and industry and on the Supreme Court, members of the Knesset, deputy speakers, Mansour Abbas, the politician from the Ram political party, and yet the media, forgive me, just largely repeat the statements made by this NGO, giving it what is commonly applied as a halo effect, as if what they say is sacrosanct and veracity. But the challenge we come through is that there's oftentimes a lack of due diligence. There's a lack of fact checking, and there is a sort of a lowest common denominator way of thinking, where there's a bit of a herd mentality for many journalists and a bit of a groupthink, and they accept as if it's conventional wisdom that Israel's an apartheid state. Little do they look at the periphery of Israel's borders and look at its various countries and see, okay, these countries, whether it's Syria or Egypt to a degree, Tunisia, elsewhere, they're largely Judenrein, have been ethnically cleansed of Jews, and yet Israel is the one that is cast as an apartheid state. Other language that we see that's misappropriated, Israel's denied being acknowledged as indigenous, and the Jewish people as indigenous to land were perceived as settler colonialists. Israel's many avowed efforts for peace offers and overtures to the Palestinian Authority are ceremoniously dismissed. This is a daily practice with the media, and it's my responsibility and that of our membership to try to educate journalists about their shortcomings. So, you might think that the work that we do is in a sense antagonistic. Actually, we're really trying to work cooperatively with the media. We don't necessarily think that journalists have an axe to grind as it comes to Israel, but there are certainly some exceptions. But by and large, it's the byproduct of a lot of serious impediments to doing media coverage of the Middle East, where you have Israel's detractors who are well-oiled, are very active, and are very committed to malign and tarnish Israel's reputation.
I wonder, it seems, or at least on the surface it seems, that the people who would be most concerned about the forwarding and advancement of correcting these misrepresentations and these twisted viewpoints in Israel would only be Jews. Is that true?
Not at all. I think everyone in Israeli society is wanting to make sure that the truth comes out. And listen, I'll be the first to say that if Israel does something that's deserving of legitimate criticism, it should be on the receiving end of it. It's when it's disproportionate that it shouldn't be. But I think, we live in a world, and I hate to use the term, but I'm going to, of fake news and alternative facts, where it is increasingly difficult for us to discern, as the title of our talk is, what is fact and what is fiction. And how are we supposed to make informed decisions, mind you, that have policy implications when the information we're relying upon is prejudicial, it lacks objectivity, and oftentimes is slanted for skewed political purposes. We have a very poisonous environment. And I think of vulnerable people in our community who are going to come to these wrong conclusions. I think of important stakeholders who are going to be making major multi-million-dollar decisions as politicians on Parliament Hill based on false reporting, opinion that's kind of disguised as news oftentimes. And that oftentimes there is that bias by omission where you don't hear the totality of what's taking place in the Middle East. I mean, I don't think I saw a Canadian news report about how, last week Saudi Arabia summarily executed 81 people. It didn't seem to register for some reason. But Israel's intervention in Ukraine, got considerable media coverage, warranted in some ways for sure, but disproportionate in others.
The effect of I remember I had a conversation with Matti Friedman, and I'd heard this fact before, but he presented it in a way that made it an indelible mark in my mind. Was that because in Israel, the news organizations enjoy a freedom of movement and expression that in many other countries in that region, they do not enjoy, both the safety to print and report things and just the physical safety to move around, that the sheer number of reporters and news organizations within tiny Israel is remarkable. I think he made a note to saying that Nigeria has 2 full-time reporters in Israel.
Exactly.
And he said that by extension of that, the sheer volume, in other words, he said you have reporters stationed there. They're being paid a salary. They have to find news. And so the sheer volume of stuff that's going to come out is going to dwarf in all proportionality what's taking place because of the presence of those reporters there. And if that is true, and I have no reason to doubt Matti being honest and accurate about this, if that's true, it seems, at least from the outside, you're very much on the inside, but from the outside, it seems that this is not even a David and Goliath fight. It seems like you're kind of punching far above one's arm's length to try to address this issue. How do you feel about that?
I like your analogy, and Matti is absolutely correct. And correct me if I'm wrong. I believe he's a Torontonian as well.
He's a Toronto boy, yes.
Former bureau chief of the Associated Press, and now just, I believe, an author, prolific author. Israel, specifically Jerusalem, has the 3rd highest concentration of journalists in the world, next to Washington. I mean, with the exception of the coverage right now about what's going on in Europe with the conflict with Ukraine and Russia, what ends up happening is that kind of a herd mentality. But the reality is you have Israel's vibrancy, its openness, and its making sure that journalists are safe. They have freedom of expression, freedom of access to pretty much anywhere and any source that they want, in sharp contrast to covering, let's say you go to Lebanon, almost immediately you're going to have a Hezbollah minder who's going to follow you, who's going to give you a skewed tour and limit your access to different areas. That's a kind of self-censorship that ends up happening. But let's just talk about the difference between free reporting and fear reporting. You can't have journalists going into Syria. The life expectancy it's atrocious. It's incredibly dangerous. And for those brave reporters, they're doing heroic work to tell the story about how, under Assad's regime, they've massacred 500,000 people and displaced millions. And that's the challenge when you contrast a liberal democracy, which is very proud to have free press credentials, to totalitarian and terrorist governments who restrict free speech and freedom of the press. When you have Iran and Turkey and other countries that are the chief jailers of journalists, when you think about Saudi Arabia and murdering Jamal Khashoggi. This is the reality. So it's not a coincidence why we don't hear about important human rights stories about the broader Middle East, about how everyday Muslim and Arabs, citizens of these various countries, are crying out for the basic liberties that we take for granted. But our media aren't really covering that story. Now, that doesn't absolve them. They should be able to report on those issues remotely. But finding sources who will go on record is really challenging, because to do so is either going to put themselves at risk or their families. So this is the kind of an effect that happens when there are governments and terrorists that really will persecute a people, and it'll create a real repression of dissent.
I wonder, this is kind of, it's an interesting road to go down in terms of a discussion, because this is almost like a chicken and egg kind of question. And I'm going to frame it like this. How much of the narrative that is generated is biased and twisted because of anti-Semitic perceptions and biases? Or is it just the existence of these biases that cause all of those reporters to be there in the first place? What's your assessment of that?
Yeah, so I would say not necessarily mutually exclusive, but I think that sometimes there are these subconscious beliefs about Israel and the Jewish people that sometimes set in, and sometimes they're quite conscious. It's really challenging. Journalists come into to covering the issue. I do believe that they're guided with doing professional reporting, that they don't come in there saying, when they wake up, I am going to write a nasty article and portray Israel in a negative light. I don't think, and I speak to them on a daily basis, but I do know, Israel's detractors are very cunning. They're very committed. They're very ready and willing to portray Israel in a negative light. And the media are looking for an easy story oftentimes. The media deal with the news maxim that if it bleeds, it leads. So, there was a report out this week that mentioned that I think Israel is, I believe, the 9th happiest country in the world, and I'm not sure how they come to that determination. But you don't hear that story. You don't. You don't hear about Israel's advancements in medicine, science, and technology. The fact that it's a startup nation. You hear about the news of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the story about the Middle East through the paradigm of violence and terrorism and war. But that's such a limited framework, and the media will oftentimes say that this is proof positive that Israel is isolated in the world. You'll always hear that story, and today is a really perfect example, which really puts that lie to rest. You look at how today Israeli Prime Minister Bennett was in Egypt to meet with the Egyptian leader Sisi and the UAE leader Crown Prince bin Zayed. Today, Singapore announced that it was going to open an Israeli embassy. You look at the Abraham Accords. Israel is in an incredible position. It's far from being isolated. It's being warmly welcomed into the community of nations. And if you want a perfect example of that and how key and important a country it is, right now, Israel is the mediating nation, the Jewish state mediating between Ukraine and Russia. Not in a million years could anybody have forecast that. So that really tells the truth about that the media had a false prognosis about who Israel is and how pivotal it is in the world of diplomacy and in the realm of the international community.
This bifurcation or almost blinding to the other narrative that's going on in Israel. It's interesting because it isn't that these things aren't reported. It's almost as if there's reporting on apparently two different countries. There's a reporting on Israel when it comes to framing conflict. And then there's a reporting on Israel, which really seems less commentary and actual reporting. So from my perception, most of the things that take place around the conflicts that surrounds Israel really assume the form of commentary. They are recycling tropes that are well embedded in people's imaginations. The people who are the authors of these tropes carefully and conscientiously repeat them over and over again. Terms like refugees, terms like banishment, displacement, things of those natures that really create in the minds of people the impression that there is a large number of people who have been literally thrown out of their homes by the Israelis. They came and knocked on their door and threw them out in the middle of the night. And once again, that seems to take more in the face of commentary than actual reporting. I have to give credit to the broader news networks when they did report on the Abraham Accords, when they do report on Israel's financial successes, when they do, in fact, talk about Israel still maintaining and expanding its diplomatic network. And of particular note was the reporting surrounding Bennett's agency between Ukraine and Russia. And in particular, if I can also add, them noting that he was an observant Jew who traveled on Shabbat, which really made, I think, a big impression. I guess what I'm not, I don't want to so much say this, but I want to ask, how do you see a way of disentangling those two narratives and focusing more on reporting and less on commentary?
This is a huge issue. It's a huge issue because journalists are tasked to be politically neutral, and yet there is a deviation. There is a tendency to be advocacy journalists, that they are partisan, that they have skin in the game to a degree. They are, in a sense, either consciously or unconsciously trying to advance a narrative or a political objective over the other. I'll give you two examples that came to mind quite recently. So in the 11-day conflict last May between Hamas and Israel, post the conflict, there was, I think, 300, 400, maybe 500 Canadian journalists of decent status, some high leverage points, some entry-level editors and journalists, but a lot of them very credible, who signed an open letter condemning Israel for committing ethnic cleansing, for carrying out indiscriminate attacks on innocent Palestinian civilians. The letter goes on and on, accusing them of war crimes, things of that nature. Now, again, journalists are tasked to not, usher in a personal opinion, and yet they signed this letter. So this was really interesting, because for us, this was a confirmation bias. For some of these people who we've had concerns over habitual problematic reporting, this confirmed it.
If I can just interrupt you for a moment, are there any names on that list that would be immediately recognizable to the people listening tonight?
I'll circulate to you and perhaps to the space if I can, the list, which it's readily published, and off the top of my head, I can't remember, but I can tell you that I think it was 20 to 25 journalists, mainstream journalists from CBC signed the letter. I think 8 from the Toronto Star, several from the Post Media, the Globe and Mail. We're not talking about fringe publications. Yes. We're talking about mainstream media outlets. What I'm happy to mention is that many of them, when we contacted them, were just totally disturbed by what they saw. They didn't defend what their journalists did because it compromised their journalistic integrity. I'll give you an example with respect to the CBC. And I credit CBC brass because they restricted those journalists from reporting on the Arab-Israeli conflict ever again, because their integrity has been compromised.
Right.
But this situation only came to light because they signed this letter. There's still many people who perhaps share that view and are still covering these kind of issues. So it is sometimes hard to discern what is a personal opinion and what is an objective statement. We try to do a lot of pattern analysis, look at reporters' coverage over time. If they're going to produce, 10 articles that are sharply critical of Israel and while ignoring, Palestinian complicity in terrorism and incitement and exposing it to what is regarded as the soft bigotry of low expectations and inherent racism, because, that same amount of criticism isn't equally applied, we'll bring it to their attention. So it's a really difficult thing to discern. It's really tough.
Yeah, no, this sounds like, and once again, I remember reading years ago, Arthur Kessler's famous report from Palestine, which Kessler left Germany, went to what was then Palestine before the outbreak of the 48 War, and he worked as a journalist. And the report from Palestine, a lot of notable things in it, but in particular, he noted how all the journalists who went there, they all had an air about them as if they were Hemingway, that they were there somehow to swashbuckle the truth and set all the wrongs right. And so that still persists. And it seems to me that not that it's an impossible task, but it's one that is ever persistent. I remember, as we're talking, 2.5 years ago, I had a sabbatical. I was in Berlin, and I had the opportunity to meet and have lunch a few times with Doug Saunders and Elizabeth Renzetti. They're a married couple. They're both reporters, columnists for the Globe and Mail. And they asked me if I would meet with a group of Canadian journalists who were visiting in Berlin. And there was some kind of scholarship or foundation that brought them over, and they wanted to have someone talk to them about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I don't want to be disrespectful to them, but this problem that exists in that region, of which Israel is a part of, Israel is not the cause of the problem. Israel is in the spoke of the wheel of many problems in that part of the world. It requires a certain kind of intellectual acumen and some kind of mastery of history, religious politics, and some theology to begin to get a grasp on what exactly are the pieces. I'm not talking about the whole narrative, just the pieces that are operating. And to be very, very fair, these people were not suited for it. They need simple storylines, and the people they write for need simple storylines. So my question for you is, based on that experience that I had, if that in fact is the truth, and it is from the way that I saw it, Mike, and the conflict it finds itself a part of is an enormously complex issue that you can't boil down into 500 words. What's the solution?
So Israel is perhaps the most complex issue to cover in contemporary reporting. There's no question. With respect to those people, Doug Saunders and Rancisi, I believe they're both commentators, opinion writers. So listen, they're entitled to their own personal opinion. But when, the common line is they're not entitled to their own facts. So if they make a factual error, then that has to be kept in check. Otherwise, if they say something that's critical of Israel, so be it. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. What I do think is interesting, and far be it for me to impugn their motives because I don't know it.
Just to be clear, it wasn't Doug and Elizabeth.
No.
It was a group of Canadian journalists that were brought by this foundation to Berlin, and they had negotiated me speaking to these other journalists. Doug and Elizabeth, by and large, I found to be very bright, very engaging, curious people who looked for facts before judgments.
Well, that's good to hear. I guess the question is, why did they turn to you? I mean, you're a rabbi, but not to slag you a bit, but you're obviously not an authority on Israel, but they went to you because you're of the Jewish faith and you're a leader in the Jewish community. But that's a situation that happens oftentimes, that regular Jewish people are asked to account and answer for Israel's actions. So, in fact, in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, it holds that when Jews are held to an impossible standard and are required to really essentially answer to the actions of Israel, that's inherently anti-Semitic. I'm not impugning their character and their motives, but the example in the past conflict with Hamas, when the conflict was raging, what happened in London, you had people going around screaming that they were going to rape Jewish wives and daughters. A sushi restaurant in Los Angeles, Jewish patrons were pretty much lynched. My colleagues in Montreal, when there was a rally, had rocks thrown at them. Jews were held responsible for the actions of the state of Israel. When synagogues are defaced with graffiti, and Rabbi, if memory serves, I think it was your synagogue that had anti-Semitic graffiti really just a matter of months ago. Oftentimes it's spurred by the kind of coverage that really does inflame tensions. And
if I can say, though,
toxic atmosphere.
If I can say that those things that you point out are more of an argument that the presence of anti-Semitism is a larger part of the narrative than perhaps people are willing to address. Because when Jews, like you said, when Jews are attacked outside of Israel, they're Canadian citizens. In other words, if you have a problem with something that Israel is doing, and you have such a problem with it, it makes you angry. And it makes you so angry that you want to be violent. Why do you attack Jews in Toronto?
Right.
Get on a plane, go to Israel, and beat up an Israeli. I mean, but the fact that you do it here is an argument of anti-Semitism, not biased reporting about Israel. So once again, we have this conflation, and the problem is, can it be disassembled in any coherent way?
Well, I think what we've seen is that it has the propensity and potential of fanning the flames. And people derive inspiration, and unfortunately, they assimilate the criticism of Israel with the Jewish community. They do not distinguish, and that's the inherent challenge. It's not a surprise that anti-Semitic instances dramatically rise at times of conflict when Israel's at necessary war.
Yeah.
So we know that there is cause and effect and causation.
You know, what came to my mind when I knew that we were going to be chatting tonight was to show or to illustrate just how deep these misinformed narratives, how they fill the cracks in the world that we live in. Reported yesterday that the president of Ukraine, in his continuing world PR tour, he spoke to the Knesset. And for those people who follow such news will know that he basically equated that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is on par with the Holocaust, and he shamed the Israelis for not intervening more in the Ukraine, given for what the Ukrainians did to the Jews or for the Jews during the Second World War. First of all, allow us to say that the Ukrainian record when it comes to Jews during the Second World War is far from impugnable. It is troublesome. In fact, in the Smithsonian magazine, if people are interested, there is an excellent article on Ukrainian collaboration with the Nazis. To be fair, also, there were many Ukrainians who also intervened to save Jews. They worked as partisans with the Soviet Union. Like many things in life, it's never black or white. There's a lot of gray. And so you see that these narratives, how they filter even into the minds of political leaders. And in part, it's because of these repeated tropes over and over again. Subsequently, of course, Zelensky did somewhat apologize. But I want to make note that in the Israeli media, that a number of the news commentators came out and said, cut him some slack. Some jumped on him.
Yeah, a lot jumped on him. I know Bennett's statement was something to the effect of, let's put this in perspective. Yes. He's fighting for his country's survival. I think by and large, the problem was the comparison, because you can't compare the Holocaust to anything. And he was rebuked for that. And there was some discourse about, he wants, for example, the Iron Dome missile interceptor. And Israel's caught in a rather precarious position, because though it in its mind, it has a moral obligation to defend a sister democracy, certainly a president who's of the Jewish faith and people who are being targeted by a totalitarian government. But in the same regard, should it cede and give its important defensive technology, it could lose its qualitative and quantitative military edge should that proprietary software and technology get out of its hands. So it's in an unenviable position. But
yes.
The amazing thing about Israel is tiny Israel, right, the size of Vancouver Island. It's committed to pretty much accept, I think, 25,000 Ukrainian refugees. Through the law of return, it's going to patriate about 100,000 Jews, Russian and Ukrainian. That's an unbelievable thing. And it shows the moral compass of the country and how everybody's trying to do what they can in an impossible situation. So Israel will get criticism. It's in a difficult position where it's told to, and in place of a mediator, which means that it in a sense can't be partisan and supportive of one side or the other, though you're seeing a little bit of diplomatic brinkmanship at play with Bennett. But it's we know that Russia really is ruling what's going on in Syria. It's allowing thankfully, it's allowing Israel to continue to take out Iranian encroachment in the area, whether it's through surface to air missiles that they're taking out or IRGC officers. It's really important that Israel has that rapport in the same regard. Israel, and through the foreign minister Yair Lapid, has also condemned Russia's act of war and aggression on Ukraine. And Israel voted with respect to the UN resolution to condemn Russia. So it's again caught in an impossible position. There's been, I think, pretty adequate media coverage of the issue, though.
Yes, no, I agree. And if I can just make one other point, and that is, Israel has a responsibility beyond its own borders. And that is that Israel has assumed on itself, both in past and present and certainly future, that it carries with itself the assumption of responsibility for the safety of Jewish communities throughout the world. And there is not a small number of Jews still in Russia and in the Ukraine and in other satellite countries around the Russian Federation. And they need to walk very, very carefully, because if this war goes as bad as it is going, and it continues to go this way, and the economic situation continues to deteriorate in the manner in which it is deteriorating, those societies, like many others, quickly look for people to blame, and they usually end up blaming Jews. And so I have to believe that the double dance between Bennett and Lapid, between condemning and not saying anything, is in part to protect their relationship with Russia regarding Syria, but also mindful of the fact of what they may be called to do in terms of protecting the Jewish communities there.
And Rabbi, let's be honest, should the mediated talks break down, which seems really very likely, Israel and the Jewish people are put in that convenient historical role of being the scapegoat once again. Whether it was, with the COVID pandemic being blamed for creating the disease or not delivering the vaccine, that's a traditional role that we're unfortunately grown accustomed to and been maligned as.
Without question, Mike, without question. I'd like to, we do have about 10 or 15 minutes left. And if I have your permission, I'd like to open the floor for people who would like to ask questions directly to you. For those of you who are listening, if you wish to ask Mike a question, I'm going to ask you to text the question directly to me, and then I will offer and share the question with Michael. As you begin to ponder whether or not you want to ask a question, I have a few points I'd like to make. Number one, we did mention Mati Friedman, a former journalist and now an exceptional author. He'll be coming to Beth Shalom on April the 2nd for in-person lunch and learn. If you'd like to attend, and I absolutely encourage you to do so, contact the Shul office, and we'll be happy to put you on the list to make you a part of the program. Okay. Abe, I hope you're happy. I plugged your program. So, but Mati's a fantastic guy, and he's got a lot to say, and it's worthy of listening to. Mike, while we wait for some questions to come in, I wonder if you could present to the people who are listening some kind of framework that you think could stem the tide and perhaps reverse some of the degrading of the proper narrative coming out of Israel.
Well, the first thing I'll say is I don't want everyone on this call to think that the role of my organization is just to be, in a sense, a professional complainer, though that's what my mother describes me as. What we're really trying to do as a grassroots organization is to really embrace, to educate, and to empower everyone to complain en masse, to get involved, to sensitize their concerns with Canadian journalists. And by the way, it's not necessarily as it relates to coverage of the Arab-Israeli conflict. If there's an issue that matters to you, whether it's domestic politics, women's rights, environmentalism, you name it, Canadian politics, you should be media literate and you should engage with journalists. And they are more than willing to have a conversation with you. Send them an email, pick up the phone, they'll talk to you. It is not a combative, antagonistic relationship. They are open-minded. At least that's my experience by and large. So I think what I'm trying to encourage, what we as an organization try to encourage, is a discourse and a dialogue between Canada's Jewish community and Canadian journalists, so that we can really do proper Israel advocacy to make sure that Israel's concerns are contextualized and that our issues are advanced.
Wonderful. And this is kind of the $6 million question. What do you think the Israeli government could do to make this better?
I have it's in a number of ways, it's in an impossible position. One of the biggest challenges I have is when there's an issue that comes up that we want to bring to light. Unfortunately, sometimes the information has to be kept confidential for security, for national security. That's an inherent challenge. There's really no way around it. If some information could be declassified with more alacrity, that would help when those situations present itself. The second is having really good, clear-speaking spokespeople who can speak to Western journalists with clear language, who can tell stories and not necessarily figures. I say that because, in Israel advocacy, we oftentimes bog down talking points down to, we were on the receiving end of 4,000 rockets. And I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't talk about that, but sometimes distilling it down to that one story of that one person who lived in Sderot or Ashkelon, whose home was decimated by a Qassam or Katyusha rocket. That story is important. And if you think about how the Palestinians tell the story, they do it through the key to their home that's allegedly been that they've allegedly been dispossessed from. So first-person narrative is important. That's something I've encouraged the Israeli government to do more of. That's something we want to do more of as well as an organization, to get pro-Israel voices out into the masses and into the media, have it ubiquitous.
I want to drill down on that just a little bit, because in Israel, there's no shortage of native English speakers. So what do you think is the impediment? Now, Mark Regev, for a number of years, had been a spokesperson for the Israeli government. I think he did an okay job. But first of all, you're 100% correct that getting native English speakers or native French speakers who are speaking to French reporters or whatnot is a huge advantage in terms of communicating a message. But why do you think that there is a consistently, and for the record, it's not just Israelis who do it, or the Israeli government, excuse me. We do it as well, because whenever there's a conflict that erupts in that area, the emails start churning amongst the Jews. We send and forward emails to each other, reminding us why we're right and they're wrong. And what it does exactly what you're saying. It engages in this laundry list of items, retread over and over again. Why do you think we engage in laundry lists as opposed to this kind of laser personalization of stories?
That's a great question. I'm not sure if we necessarily do, to be perfectly honest, that we carry our narratives and baggage consistently forward. My experience, to be perfectly honest, is we focus on issues. What I'd like to think is that we as a community don't make blanket accusations of anti-Semitism when they're not occurring. But what I'd like to see more of is for us to be laser focused. If there's a particular issue we want to advance or a particular problem, focus on it. Don't just group every possible issue and say this is just Toronto Star. People will say this is another example of the Red Star from 20 years ago, that we should what was the term, that we should cancel subscriptions and cancel advertisements. And we're of the exact opposite mindset. We think more people should be monitoring problematic publications, and we're not supportive of divestment campaigns against uncooperative media. We don't think it's complementary in any possible way. So I want us to be, if I can, I don't want to say single skewed, but laser focused. I think that's the path of least resistance.
I'd like to advance a theory. And the theory I'd like to advance is that I think that we have a cultural tendency to think that we can prove people to acknowledge and make a point by facts, as opposed to not working to convince people of things and simply saying what we want to say. I somehow think that, like you point out, in particular, certain channels in the Palestinian organizations don't care about the people who don't agree with them. They're talking to the people who do agree with them. And I think that the persecuted hat that Jews rightly wear, by the way, has a double-edged sword to it. My grandmother, a blessed memory, she left Germany in 1936 with my father in her hands, and they ran away. And she one time said to me, it's a long story, I'm not going to go into it, but at the end of the story, she said to me, she said, Aaron, she says, you're not a Jew. She says, you're an Israeli. And what she was trying to say to me is that I don't walk around with the kind of fear that she walked around with her whole life. Because on some level, Israel rid me of that fear of disposition that she rightly had experienced in her life. And I wonder if somehow we could learn to adopt and accept a little bit more of that with some courage of just talking to the people who agree with us. Because I suspect, and by the way, whenever there's a conflict that does erupt, my voicemail box fills overwhelmingly with non-Jewish Canadians who are calling to voice their support for Israel.
Amazing.
Yeah, no, it is amazing, I have to say. And I try to call back some of them because they leave their numbers. Not everyone does. But I think that there are a lot of good-minded, balanced, well-regarded people who the Jews can talk to, and the people will at least be open to listening the things that we say to the people who agree with us. Not everything is a courtroom, is what I'm trying to say. We don't have, no questions came in, so I guess you did a phenomenal job in explaining your position. Now, just before we close the evening off, a few questions for you, Mike. You say that the organization has 50,000 members. How does someone become a member of Honest Reporting?
Sure. I should say we're entirely free. If you go to www.honestreporting.ca, sign up. Simple as
Wonderful.
that.
Wonderful. As that. And is your organization a nonprofit? Do people make donations to it?
Absolutely. We are a nonprofit organization.
Okay.
And we're supported exclusively by personal donations, large and small.
So my beloved congregants of Beth Shalom Synagogue, who are renowned both far and wide for their extraordinary philanthropy, I want you to go to Honest Reporting and contribute to the remarkable work that they do. Mike here is an important voice in combating the terrible narratives that are repeated and churned out over and over again that warp the reality of what takes place in Israel and the Middle East. And as we found out, certainly this past spring, about how it can affect us at our very doorsteps. So please, everyone, be vigilant. And Mike very much is at the forefront of promoting the vigilance. I thank you so much. He's also a neighbor of the shul, so come by any time.
I will.
I know that Alan Cheskis will have an excellent cup of scotch or some other sharp beverage for you. Okay, 1 second. Some questions did come in. One is thanking you for your commitment, your chutzpah, and holding people to account. The other is was a person said that they believe it would be helpful to stop referring to terrorist actions in Israel as the Arab-Israeli conflict, but rather simply referring to it as terrorism. We should try to position ourselves on the same side as the Arab community. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's a fair comment. Listen, when it comes down to the lexicon, our media won't even use the term terrorism. Like, they won't call a spade a spade. Mm-hmm. They will whitewash terror organizations and not even describe them as, they'll call them everything because they wear a three-piece suit. They'll call them militants or insurgents or combatants.
Or just an Arab or a Palestinian.
Yeah, they'll fully take away that person was a gunman or had carried out a stabbing attack. By the way, a stabbing attack happened yesterday. I think the more that our media can speak in plain language and give the full unvarnished truth, the better. And I think it's an interesting point to take into consideration. Because quite frankly, the idea that there is an Arab-Israeli conflict with Israel now at peace with how many nations, right? Jordan,
Exactly.
Egypt, UAE,
Yeah, Jordan, 1 second, Jordan, Egypt,
Sudan,
UAE,
Sudan and Bahrain.
Sudan, Bahrain. So we're at 6 now. Saudi Arabia is going to come very soon, I suspect.
Yes, Saudi Arabia, Oman. The reality is, and
Yes.
it's a fair comment from your congregant, is there really an Arab-Israeli conflict?
Yeah,
The
fair
reality
enough.
is what we know is that the enemy of our enemy is our friend.
Mhm.
And with respect to Iran's hegemonic goals for the region and quest for nuclear weapons, it's brought a confluence of the Arab world to be really brethren with the Jewish people, and it's an amazing thing. It's an amazing thing. They
It
hop
is.
on a flight and go to the UAE, and there's commerce and trade and relations and sharing of vital security infrastructure and intelligence. It's unthinkable. I've been at the organization for 18 years. I mean, I'm still blown away by what's transpired in only a number of years. Albeit everybody knows that these kind of warm relations happened prior to the signing of the agreements. But even so, the fact that they've come to a forefront shows how proud they are and how important that the different countries are as strategic partners.
Yes, well said. Very well said. Mike, I want to thank you so much for your time tonight. You've really educated us all. I found an excellent person to talk to, so I really appreciate that as well. Everyone, once again, go to www.honestreporting.ca, become a member, sign up, and like I said, also donate to the important work that Mike and his organization are doing. Everyone stay safe and warm, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. And Mike, a big thank you again. Much appreciated.
My absolute
Have a good
pleasure.
evening.
Thank you very much. All the best. Thank you.
You too.